The sun was a brassy, unforgiving eye in the washed-out Kansas sky, baking the main street of Redemption until the wooden boardwalks shimmered with heat. Dust devils danced listlessly in the road, and the only sounds were the lazy drone of flies and the rhythmic squeak of a lone rocking chair on the porch of the Redemption Mercantile. That's where they gathered, the men who had made the town their own, the owners, the traders, the men with money and influence. They held court there every afternoon, sipping lukewarm sarsaparilla and watching the world crawl by. At the center of their amusement was the widow's guard. He was a fixture, as immovable and weathered as the hitching posts. They called him Old Henry, a name that held no weight, no history. He was simply the man who lived in the small, whitewashed cottage at the edge of town with the widow Calder, the last remaining member of a once prominent ranching family. He was her shadow, her protector, a title that seemed a cruel joke to the men who watched him. He was a walking ruin. His spine was curved into a permanent question mark, his shoulders hunched as if perpetually bracing against a wind no one else could feel. His hands, gnarled and liver-spotted, trembled with a persistent palsy, and his eyes, the color of faded denim, were perpetually half-lidded, as if the effort of seeing was to... His clothes were clean but threadbare, a simple cotton shirt, a worn leather vest, and trousers held up by suspenders that seemed to be fighting a losing battle against his frailty. He moved with the agonizing slowness of a man wading through deep water, his steps short and shuffling, the tap-tap-tap of his gnarled hickory walking stick a steady, weary beat on the dusty ground. "Look at him," snickered Bartholomew Finch, the portly owner of the Mercantile, his chins wobbling as he gestured with a cigar. The widow's pitiful old watchdog. If a stray cat were to sneeze too loud, he'd probably keel over. A wave of chuckles rippled through the group. Sealers Hornsby, the banker, a man with a face like a wrinkled prune and a heart to match, nodded. "A waste of good food, if you ask me. The woman could have hired a man half his age for a tenth of the cost. Why she keeps him on, I'll never know. Sentimentality, I suppose." "Oh, pity," added young Jasper Crow, the son of the livery stable owner, eager to impress his elders. "He looks like he'd blow over in a strong wind. My grandmother could take him in a fight." The laughter grew louder, cruel, barking sound that echoed in the empty street. Old Henry, shuffling past on his way back from the well with a bucket of water paused. The water sloshed over the rim, a few drops darkening the dust at his feet. He lifted his head slowly, and for a moment, the men on the porch saw something, a fleeting flicker in those faded eyes, a deep, bottomless cold that made the air around them seem to drop a few degrees. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the dull, roomy gaze of a bewildered old man. He sighed, a soft, rasping sound, and continued on his way, the tap-tap-tap of his stick resuming its mournful rhythm. The men on the porch felt a strange, unspoken chill, then shook it off, laughing louder to prove to themselves they hadn't felt anything at all. Feeble-minded as well as feeble-bodied, Finch declared, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "The widow's got a heart of gold and a head full of sawdust, keeping that relic around." The object of their derision, Henry Blackwood, made his way back to the cottage. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had heard their words, the same words he'd heard in the daytowns, from 100 different men, for the better part of 40 years. They saw the stooped frame, the tremors, the shuffling gait. They saw a man at the end of his life. They were blind to the truth. They saw the shell. They didn't see the steel within. He found the widow Calder in her small, neat kitchen, a woman of 50 with silver-streaked hair and kind, intelligent eyes that had seen their share of sorrow. She was kneading dough, her movements strong and sure. She looked up as he entered, and a smile, the kind that transformed her face, touched her lips. "Henry, you shouldn't be out in this heat. I could have fetched the water." He set the bucket down gently by the stove. "It's nothing, Emily," kneaded the air. His voice was low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together, a stark contrast to his decrepit appearance. She looked at him closely, her sharp gaze missing nothing. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the seal that briefly glinted in his eyes. Those men on the porch again. A ghost of a smile touched his own lips. "They're not important." "They are if they get to you," she said gently, moving to his side and placing a flour-dusted hand on his arm. "You don't have to do this, Henry. You don't have to protect me from whispers." He looked down at her, and the hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a profound, ancient affection. "I gave your husband my word, Emily, on his deathbed. He was my friend, the last real friend I ever had. And this place," he gestured vaguely, his hand trembling more violently for a moment. "This piece of land. It's the only piece I've ever known. I won't let anyone take it from you, from us." It was then that the sound of rowdy, drunken laughter echoed from the direction of the saloon, a lewd, aggressive sound that had no place in the quiet afternoon. Emily's face paled. "It's the gang from the mine. The new foreman, Harker, and his men. They've been making noise, threatening to buy up the whole east side of the valley for cheap." Henry's eyes narrowed, the faded denim turning to chips of flint. "Harker. I've seen him." A loud mouth with a tin star pinned to his chest and a brain full of cheap whiskey. "He's dangerous, Henry. A man like that, he won't stop at threats." Henry patted her hand, his own surprisingly steady. "He'll stop. When the time is right, he'll stop." He turned his gaze to the window, out towards the raucous saloon. His mind drifted, as it often did in moments of quiet contemplation, back to a different town, a different life. A life lived in a perpetual haze of gunsmoke and whiskey, of barkeeps and dance-hall girls, of men with quick hands and even quicker tempers. He remembered the smell of cordite, the sound of a hammer being cocked, the final, surprised look in a man's eyes as he realized his draw wasn't quite fast enough. He remembered the name they used to call him then, a name that could silence a crowded room. The Shadow from Dutch. A name whispered with fear and respect from the dusty streets of Abilene to the lawless border towns of the Rio Grande. A name he had buried along with his Colt Dutch 5 years ago. That gun was still there, wrapped in an oiled cloth in a secret compartment in the floor of his small, Spartan room. He hadn't touched it in over 20 years. He hoped he wouldn't have to. The next morning, the peace was shattered. Emily was in the garden, tending her roses, a rare splash of crimson against the dry, brown earth. Henry was on the porch, mending a harness, his old fingers working with slow, deliberate care. The sound of hoofbeats brought his head up. Jeremiah Harker and his two chief cronies, a weasel-faced man named Tibbs and a huge, ox-like brute called Sneed, rode into the yard, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Harker was a large man, florid face, with a black mustache and a cruel glint in his pig-like eyes. The tin spar on his chest was his only license, a symbol of nothing more than his own brute force. Well, if it isn't the widow Calder tending her little flowers," Harker bellowed, not dismounting. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice oily with false sympathy. "A mighty fine rose, ma'am. Pity it won't be blooming here much longer." Emily stiffened but didn't turn around. "Good morning, Mr. Harker. I have no business with you." "Oh, but I think you do," Harker said, his voice hardening. "The owners of the new mine are prepared to make you a very generous offer for this land. A fair price, more than it's worth. It's time to sell, widow. This valley is for commerce now, not for memories." Henry set down the harness and slowly, painfully, rose to his full height, which was still several inches shorter than Harker's. He shuffled to the edge of the porch, planting his walking stick firmly. "A widow Calder is not selling," he said, his voice as quiet as the rustle of dry leaves. "You can tell your bosses that." Harker's head snapped towards the old man, surprise and contempt fighting for dominance on his face. He let out a bark of laughter. "And who the hell are you, you old fossil?" The woman's scarecrow, Tibbs and Sneed joined in, their laughter coarse and ugly. "I'm the man telling you to leave," Henry replied, his voice unchanged. Harker spurred his horse forward, stopping it right in front of Henry. The horse snorted, blowing hot fetid breath into the old man's face. Harker looked down at him, his face twisted in a sneer. "Listen to me, you broken-down piece of history. You're a nothing, a nobody. The only reason you're still breathing is because I don't want to dirty my boots kicking your corpse into the gutter. I'm giving the widow 1 week. 1 week to sign the papers, or we'll start coming around with more than just words." He turned to his men. "Let's go, boys. We've wasted enough time on this filth." They wheeled their horses and cantered off, their laughter trailing behind them. Emily rushed to Henry's side. "Are you all right? He didn't touch you." "He didn't dare," Henry said, his eyes still fixed on the disappearing riders. The steel was back, cold and unyielding. "Emily, go inside. Fetch me the strong books from under my bed, and my old carpet bag." She looked at him, a question in her eyes, but the look on his face silenced it. She had known him for nearly 15 years, ever since her husband, Samuel, had brought him, a half-dead stranger found in a ditch, riddled with a fever that should have killed. Samuel had nursed him back to health, and Henry had become a part of their lives, a quiet, dependable presence. She had never asked about his past. She had sensed it was a place he was terrified to revisit. But now, seeing the transformation in his posture, the way his shoulders straightened, the iron grip on his walking stick, she knew a stranger was in her house. She went inside, her heart hammering. She retrieved the heavy iron strong books from under his bed, a task that was difficult and left her breathing hard, and the worn leather carpet bag. She brought them to him on the porch. He took the key, a small iron thing he wore on a thong around his neck, and opened the box. He bypassed the neatly folded stacks of banknotes and carefully drew out a worn, oiled cloth bundle. He carried it to the kitchen table, placed it down, and unwrapped it. Emily gasped. It was a Colt .45, a peacemaker, the blued steel still holding a deep, mirror-like sheen. The ivory grips were yellowed with age, but she could see they were exquisitely carved with an intricate pattern. He held it, and the tremors in his hand ceased completely. It was as if the gun had a will of its own, a calming influence on the man who held it. He checked the cylinder, his movements swift, fluid, and utterly foreign to the halting old man she knew. It was fully loaded. He slid it into a worn, black leather holster he'd retrieved from the bag, then strapped the rig around his waist, the weight settling on his hips like it had never left. He also took out a folded, faded piece of paper and a small, leather-bound journal. "What are you doing, Henry?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, and his eyes were ancient, filled with a sorrow that made her chest ache. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, Emily. I'm going to take a walk to the saloon. I need to have a word with Mr. Harker." "Henry, no. He'll kill you. You can't go up against men like that. We have to get the sheriff." "The sheriff is a coward," Henry said, his voice flat. "He's on Harker's payroll. If it had been the other way around, Harker would have killed him. But they are cut from the same cloth." He tucked the faded paper and journal into his shirt pocket. He was no longer the stooped, shuffling old man. He stood with a rammed straightness that defied his age, a dangerous stillness in his movements. The walking stick was now just a prop, held loosely in his left hand, while his right hand hung near the worn grip of the Colt. "You can't," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, Henry, you'll be killed." "If I don't go, they will come back and they will hurt you," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "And that I will not allow, not while I'm still breathing. You understand?" I made a promise. As he walked out the door, he paused. It's been a good life, Emily. The only one I ever really had. The walk to the saloon was an eternity. He moved with a steady, unhurried purpose, his footsteps sure and silent on the wooden sidewalk. The few townsfolk who saw him stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Was that old Henry? Was he wearing a gun? The news spread like wildfire. The men on the porch, Finch, Hornsby, and Crow, saw him coming. Their laughter died in their throats. Something was profoundly, terrifyingly different. He looked at them with a passing glance, as a man might glance at a weed in his path, and it was all they could do not to shrink away. He reached the swinging doors of the Last Chance Saloon. The sound of tinny piano music and loud, raucous laughter spilled out. He didn't pause. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by a few oil lamps. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and whiskey. Harker and his men were at a table near the back, surrounded by a few other miners and a couple of saloon girls. The piano player stopped mid-song as the saloon doors swung shut. A heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes were on the old man. Henry Blackwood stood in the center of the room. He looked at the bartender. "I'm here to see Jeremiah Harker." Harker, drunk and belligerent, slammed his whiskey glass on the table and stood up. He grinned a savage, mocking grin. "Well, well, well. If it isn't the widow's scarecrow. Dress for a gunfight." He gestured to the Colt. "Where did you get that, old man? Steal it from a museum?" A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the room. Henry didn't acknowledge it. He slowly drew the faded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up. "I'm not here for a gunfight, Harker. I'm here to give you a choice." He began to read from the paper, his voice low, but it carried with a clear ring of authority that silenced the room. It was the voice of a man used to being heard. It was the voice of a man who had never needed to shout. "This notice is to declare that the claimant, Henry Blackwood," legally known as. He paused and looked up at Harker with eyes that were like chips of ice. "The Shadow from Dodge is the sole owner of the Calder Ranch, as a debt of honor owed to Samuel Calder, signed and witnessed by the territorial judge, Elias P. Grant." The name hung in the air like a physical blow. It landed on the room with the force of a thunderclap. The blood drained from Harker's face. The color drained from the bartender's. A few of the older men in the room gasped, their eyes wide with sudden, dawning terror. Someone in the crowd whispered, "The Shadow from Dodge. The one who killed." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Harker's confidence wavered, but the whiskey gave him a false bravado. "The Shadow from Dodge is a legend, a fairy tale, a ghost. You're just a senile old man with a fake name and a rusty gun." His hand twitched towards his own holster. Henry didn't move a muscle, but his eyes locked onto Harker's with a dead, pitiless intensity. "I am giving you one chance, Harker. One chance to leave this town. Pack your things, get on your horse, and ride. Ride fast, and ride far. If you are within 100 miles of this valley by sundown, I will take that as a refusal of my offer." His voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper, but it was the most terrifying sound anyone in the room had ever heard. Harker's hand dropped to his gun. "You're a liar!" he roared, his face crimson. "You're a pathetic, useless old man." Henry sighed. It was a sound of profound weariness. He had given the man a choice, a real choice. It was more than he had given most men in his past. "Very well," he murmured, and the world seemed to slow down. Harker made his draw. He was fast. He was younger. He was full of whiskey-fueled arrogance. But as his hand closed around the grip of his pistol, he was looking at a man who had been drawing the gun in saloons just like this one before Harker had even been born. A man who had seen every trick, every tell, every moment of hesitation that a killer's mind could produce. The bartender later swore he never saw Henry's hand move. There was just a blur, a flash of fire, and the thunderous report of the Colt. Harker's gun had barely cleared his holster when the .45 slug punched through the center of his chest, spinning him halfway around before he crashed backward onto the table, sending a cascade of glass and whiskey to the floor. The silence was absolute. Henry stood in the same spot, a wisp of smoke curling from the barrel of his peacemaker. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold, ancient stone. He didn't even look at the body. His eyes swept over the room, lingering for a moment on Tibbs and Sneed. Both men had their hands frozen in the air, their faces a mask of pure terror. Henry spoke again, his voice soft and quiet. "Does anyone else have a claim on the Calder land?" Tibbs shook his head violently. Sneed was speechless, his jaw working uselessly. "Anyone else want to call me a liar? A fossil? A scarecrow?" He looked pointedly at the men huddled at the bar, the same men who had laughed on the porch. Silas Hornsby was trying to blend into the wall. Bartholomew Finch was fanning himself with his hat. Jasper Crow looked as if he was about to be sick. No one dared to speak. Henry holstered his pistol with a smooth, practiced motion. He walked to the table where Harker lay, plucked the tin star from his vest, and tossed it into the sawdust. He then retrieved the discarded paper, folded it, and put it back in his pocket. The entire time, not a single sound was made by anyone other than him. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his footsteps echoing in the deathly silence. The moment he disappeared through the swinging doors, the dam broke. A frantic, chaotic babble of voices erupted. Men rushed to the body, then rushed away from it. Silas Hornsby hurried out the back door. Bartholomew Finch fainted dead away in his chair. Jasper Crow ran to the stables to find the sheriff. Henry Blackwood walked back to the cottage. The sun was high, the heat shimmering off the street, but he felt nothing. He felt the familiar hollow emptiness that followed a kill. The peace he had sought for so long, the quiet life with the roses and the harnesses, had been shattered. He had become the monster he had tried to bury. He knew, as he approached the white picket fence, that he would have to leave. There was no place in this world for the shadow from Dodge. Emily was waiting on the porch, her face pale and etched with worry. When she saw him, unharmed, walking up the path, she let out a ragged sob. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the emptiness in his eyes, and she didn't need to ask. She knew. She ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, her tears soaking into his worn vest. "It's over, Henry," she sobbed. "You ended it. It's over." He held her gently, patting her back with a hand that now trembled once more. "No, Emily," he said, his voice tired and old. "It's just beginning." He looked over her shoulder towards the town, where he knew a frantic mob would soon be forming. He wasn't worried about being lynched. He was worried about what his presence would bring to her. "I have to go." "No," she cried, clinging to him. "They won't touch you. You're a hero. You saved us." "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice hard again. "I'm a killer. I've always been a killer. That's all I know how to be. That's why I came here, to bury that part of me. But you can't bury it forever. It lives, and it wants to feed. And if I stay, there'll be more." Harker was just the beginning. There will always be another Harker, another challenge, and the demon in me will answer it. This was my last stand, Emily. My final dance. He gently disentangled himself from her embrace. "I have to go back to the grave I crawled out of." He walked past her into the house and went to his small room. He retrieved the key from around his neck and unlocked the strong box again, leaving the money for her. All of it. He took the Colt, reloaded the one spent round, and placed it back in its holster. He then took the small journal and tucked it in his pocket. He took his worn, dusty Stetson from its peg and put it on, its brim pulled low over his eyes. When he emerged from his room, he was transformed once more. He was a man of shadow and silence, a ghost from a violent and unforgiving past. The tapping of his walking stick was gone. He didn't need it anymore. He moved with a deadly, fluid grace. He walked to the front door, stopping in the doorway. Emily was there, crying, her hands clasped in front of her. "Don't go, Henry. Please don't go. This is your home." He looked around at the cottage, the small garden with its crimson roses, the neat kitchen, the quiet peace he had stolen for himself. For a moment, a crack appeared in his stony visage. "It was my home," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It was the best home a man could ever ask for. And for that, Emily, I thank you. I thank Samuel every day for giving me this." He met her eyes, and she saw the lost soul behind the legend. "But I'm not a man who gets to stay in his home. I'm a man who makes sure other people can stay in theirs. That's my only purpose. That's my only skill." He held her gaze for a final, long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. The townsfolk, emboldened by the sheriff, were gathered at the saloon. They were talking, shouting, pointing guns at shadows when they saw old Henry walk out of the widow's cottage and head for the dusty trail that led out of town. He didn't look back. He didn't hurry. He just walked, a solitary figure of black and dust, heading into the vast, unforgiving prairie. They didn't follow. They didn't dare. They just watched him recede into the shimmering heat. The man who was no longer a joke. The man who was no longer old. The man who wasn't even a man at all, but a living, breathing legend. And as the dust closed in around him, Henry Blackwood, a man of many names, vanished into the horizon, leaving behind only a small leather-bound journal on the kitchen table of the widow Calder's home, the first page of which bore a single entry, dated nearly 40 years earlier in a cramped, careful script to Dodge City, 1876. "Killed 3 more today. I can't remember their faces. I can't remember my own. I need to end this, or it will end me. I'm done. I'm going to find a hole somewhere and crawl inside it." The last word, written in a different ink, was added just before he left. It said simply, "I found it. I found my peace. Thank you, Emily."